good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, coming in from around the world, which is very exciting. It's good to see all the people trickling in. This is a short session, so if you'll forgive me, I'm just gonna get right into it. And just say thank you again for joining us for our side event, to the pre-summit for the Food Systems Summit. I want to extend a special thank you to the organizers of the summit for all their hard work and for inviting us to share our interventions here today. My name is Andrew Schwartz, and I work at the Center for Earth Ethics. It's my honor to play host and moderator for this session. I want to introduce my colleagues who are joining me today. We've got Lena May, the technical officer with the World Health Organization, Mariam Hussein, president of the Islamic Medical Association of North America, an oncology fellow at The Ohio State University, Gopal Patel, co-founder and director of Bhumi Global, and Chris Elisara, director at the World Evangelical Alliance Creation Care Task Force and senior fellow at the Orman Center at Duke Divinity School. This session, Faith and Food, Cultivating Seeds of Change, comes from the work done by the Faith and Food Coalition, which happened over 5 weeks, where we hosted 5 different dialogues that brought together 40 speakers and engaged nearly 1,500 people from around the globe. COVID-19 has been devastating to the world and to our food systems, but it's not as though the food systems were flourishing before COVID struck. The Minister of Health of Mexico commented in his intervention yesterday, Mexico was already in the midst of a health pandemic due to the proliferation of cheap, unhealthy foods that drive diabetes and obesity and other diet-related NCDs. The same story can be told in nearly every corner of the world, where commodified and heavily industrialized processed foods drive poor health. As we enter today's conversation and this pre-summit and look towards the food summit in the fall, we can say with a great deal of confidence that we know what doesn't work and what isn't solving the global hunger problem. We can also say with equal confidence that we know what needs to be done. The question is how we motivate action to get from 0 to 1, which is why we are approaching this from the lens of faith and ethics and spirituality. And with that in mind, I want to open it up to Mariam first for your perspective as a doctor and a person of faith about why including faith and ethics is so important as we look at food systems transformation.
Well, hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction, Andrew. And I'm so, as I've been saying, I'm so honored to be here with these friends and to have this conversation. So, so specifically as a physician, that when we all take the Hippocratic Oath, when you're a first-year medical student, there's an iteration that Hippocrates said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." And honestly, not up until recently did that really struck me that, you know, as a scientist, you can't ignore the very real importance of food as it impacts our health. We're inextricably linked to it with our culture, with our faith as well, too. And if we're being completely honest, we can no longer deny the very real impacts of our current food systems on the value and health of our food. When we look at processed food and unhealthy food that's just masquerading around as healthy food, right? And so as a physician, when you want to try to help improve people's health, you realize how many factors are going up against with all these social determinants and commercial determinants of health going on. But specifically as it relates to food as well, too, that you can't deny the science and the natural science that's behind the health of these foods. And then there's a lot of science that can't explain a lot of things that we've seen, right? That these stories that I could tell you just how much you needed faith to get through something or get through a patient's illness. And so instead of looking at these two things as odds per se, I think incorporating this aspect of faith, spirituality, this interconnectedness that we have, to even just one aspect of health, which is food and the food that we intake, it's unbelievably important, and it's no longer undeniable at this point. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to my colleagues there. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Mariam. And to you, Gopal, I wonder from your perspective, and I think this is something we talked about leading into this conversation, is there's many of the traditions that we have in our faith traditions around food are connected to a time and a place, and so I'm curious for your thoughts on kind of how do we take the wisdom and apply it to now, to the circumstances that we're seeing, where there are so many people, there are so many new complications to figure out. How do we kind of take the best from the wisdom traditions of old and apply it to the problems that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. It's great to be with you. I think that is that's the opportunity, I think, for faith-based organizations, wisdom traditions, cultures, to see what are the principles, what are the values that underpinned religious food systems, and what can we learn from those principles and apply them to the modern world. I think often of, in the Jewish faith, in the Jewish tradition, there's this understanding that I believe it's every 7 years you do not do any agriculture, you do not harvest, you let the earth regenerate every 7 years, understanding that even the earth herself needs time to rest and regrow and rejuvenate before she's ready to give again. And you see understandings and teachings like that across different faith traditions, across history, in every single corner of the world. And so it's about not necessarily, sometimes it's about the practices and seeing how the practices are applicable. But I think more than that, it's what is the essence? What are the principles? What are the values that underpinned Islamic farming, Hindu farming, Christian farming? And we have examples of those either in the holy books of those traditions or in the oral traditions as well. And so what can we learn from those and bring those into the current context of our globalized food systems, where, as you said, rapid change needs to take place in a very short period of time if we are to meet the challenges that we're facing over the next decade and beyond. So I think that's really the critical opportunity and invitation for faith-based organizations at this critical juncture.
Thank you, Gopal. Really appreciate that. And to you as well, Miriam. And with that in mind, I want to now hand it over to you, Lena, and invite you to think about, as we're looking at our food systems and as this question of values, right? Of, how do we understand what needs to be valued most as we look forward at our food systems? Right now, there's a heavy premium on profits, commodification of industrialization. But as we look at those, and then we also look at the fact that 1 in 9 people are going to hungry every night, yet there's enough food waste in the world to feed all those people. It's not a problem of production. It's a problem of what we're privileging, what we're allowing, what we value. And apparently what we value is not feeding people. And so, as we look at the transformation that needs to come, I'd love for you to share a bit about this growing movement around universal food access and why it's so important to consider.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, first of all, for inviting me. And I'm so impressed because for you guys, it's so late at night. So I really feel honored to be able to speak with you and to have this conversation. And this event on faith and food and cultivating the seeds for change is really, for me, important that we talk about this at the sidelines of the pre-summit. Colleagues, you mentioned it already, Andrew, but why is it that there is enough food to feed every single person in the world? And as you say, that 720 million people go to bed hungry every night, while at the same time, 2 billion people suffer from overweight or obesity. And why is it that COVID-19 has increased the number of chronically undernourished people with 161 million people, the largest increase in a year since decades, and that more than 40 million people are on the brink of starvation in fragile countries affected by multiple shocks. And 1 in 3 children under 5 is suffering from malnutrition, and the numbers are staggering, with 149 million children stunted, 45 million children wasted, 39 million children suffering from overweight and obesity. on another side, why do people frown when a mother is breastfeeding her child in public? Isn't that normal? And why can't 3 billion people afford a healthy diet? And in the UK, 1 in 3 children is overweight or obese by the time they leave primary school. And then why is it then that in the UK, spending on unhealthy food advertising is 30 times greater than spending by the government on healthy eating habits? And on top of that, why are vulnerable populations often more targeted with unhealthy food and beverage marketing? In England's poorest areas, there are like fast food hotspots 5 times more outlets than in the most affluent areas. So the title of this event is most appropriate for what I want to do, is to plant a seed of change. And we are not on track to achieve the SDGs. We are not on track to reach the global nutrition targets, and our global food system is broken. Access to food cannot exclusively be determined by purchasing power. And that's why in the Food System Summit Action Track 5 on resilience, the concept of universal food access is being promoted. And I'm leading the Universal Food Access Action Area with 2 other co-chairs. And this action area might be evolving into a coalition, which is called Universal Food Access and Indigenous Peoples Food Systems. And so during the Food Systems Pre-Summit, we are planting the seed here and there of the concept of universal food access. And we've done so, and we are doing that in several sessions. For example, yesterday, the concept was mentioned at the opening by the chair of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues. And it was mentioned by the Action Track 5 co-chair in an intervention on agroecology. And today, it will also be elaborated upon in the session on human rights in the pre-summit at 10 o'clock. So there's still time if you want to watch it. And also, it will be mentioned in the Action Track 5 session at 11:30. And in addition, the co-chairs are also organizing a session at the Alternative Food Systems for People Summit. You know, there is an alternative session also going on. And so this afternoon at 1:30 CEST, there will be a session, and you can still register for that. So what do we mean with universal food access? And universal food access disrupts the common view on food as a commodity. And in our view, food is a basic human need that should not be a privilege of those who have money to pay for it. So food should be seen in a more diverse and inclusive way, and in 3 ways. First, as a human right that should be protected, fulfilled, and respected. Secondly, as a common good that should be provided through community collective actions and customary food systems, and as a public good that should be regulated by the state on behalf of its citizens and provided by the state to the needy, leaving no one behind. And so it's a kind of a tricentric food governance policy mix that combines market provision based on supply and demand, public provision based on citizens' rights, and civic collective actions for foods. And interestingly, also, these concepts have been practiced for ages in a very successful way by, for example, indigenous peoples in their food systems. So universal food access also prioritizes local production for local consumption. And so the concept of universal food access can look different in different contexts in countries, as you can have a mix of these 3 kind of components of market provision, public provision, and collective action. And so it can be different in a different country. And every country can determine the mix for their context as long as universal food access is achieved. And examples of public good interventions, for example, is school feeding or social protection programs, or recycling of expired foods like it is done in France. And examples of the commons are common kitchens, collective vegetable gardens, promotion of food sharing and co-producing. And so as WHO, we are interested in this concept, as we are also promoting the universal health coverage. And also UNESCO is promoting the idea of education for all. So maybe there could even be a universal vital needs compact in the making, who knows? So what I've done now is to kind of planted my seed with you, because I see a lot of alignment with the faith-based organizations and with your views and principles, the respect of traditions, including indigenous wisdom, the reconnecting with an ethical food system, your aim for better social, economic, and ecological outcomes of food systems, and so on. So let's see if this seed can grow. It will not go easy, it will not go fast, but let's see if we can make this happen. Over back to you.
Thank you so much, Lena. That is, I love it. I really love it. Yeah. I do have a follow-up question, and this is kind of, and I'll just, I guess I'll say it very simply of, as you think about partnering with faith groups and faith traditions, where do you see the greatest potential for faith groups to assist in this work?
Where? Well, there's the where and there's the how. I mean, you can serve as a moral compass. We need moral compasses that guide people, and just a sheer number of people of different religions is massive, and power is in the numbers, I would say. You have so many connections at the grassroots. As you said, also, we need to be science-based, and science and faith do not have to be at odds. So providing the correct information and then using the norms and principles to get it out there and have it practiced is something that is so powerful and that can be done with faith-based organizations. And we need to increase and enlarge our food movements. And I mean, I just see you guys as a perfect partner for this.
Yeah, thank you. And Miriam, I'm going to ask for a follow-up real quick, but I think that's right. I do, as you look at the power that faith traditions hold, that religious communities have, the partnership is so clear, and really that call to action, that call to, religious communities. I think of the Sikhs, I think of the soup kitchens that the Catholic Church has always provided. But I think part of the challenge here is that like religious communities have always been a backstop to many of the failures of society, where the question isn't like, well, you just go the church to, if you're hungry, or the food pantry, or to the cafeteria, whatever it is, without asking that question backwards of like, why are people hungry? Why do they need to go to the church for the first place? Like, and I think that's part of that moral obligation, that moral responsibility of not just allowing that status quo that, well, the churches have always stepped up, the temples have always been there, the synagogues are always providing. Well, that doesn't need to be their job. And I think that's also a role of faith communities, is to kind of, as you're saying, like really raising this moral voice and that conviction of it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's part of this giant transformation of just kind of looking at the absurdities as you're listing off the stats that you did. It's just crazy. It's crazy how many people are suffering unnecessarily. And that needs to be said more loudly and more robustly, because it's wild. It's absolutely wild. Miriam, and so I want to come to you then with kind of to build off of that and because you raised it, that dissonance that we often see between science and faith, and how can these two, come into better connection and bolster one another as we look at the problems that we need to overcome?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the question. That's a personal interest of mine, at least. And so I think, one thing that's undeniable is that so much of the advancements in health, right, have been because of the evolution of science, right? So this isn't saying that one is bad or one is all a good. But if we're being honest, especially when it comes to health and systems wise, is that so much of the focus is on disease care, not healthcare. And if we don't see the forest through the trees, right, is that people need health, and not just health but healing. And when you go through a trauma of any illness, right, going through anything like that, everybody who's gone through something like that, big or small, I think we sometimes miss out on the opportunity on the back end. Is that how do we heal people afterwards, right? It's kind of like you've gone through this, and now we're going to rely on time to help you heal back together, and then let us know when something happens again, right? That's kind of the dogma. But I think as so much of people who have been on the front lines, these food actors who are way more experts than I am on this, they can attest that we don't have that time anymore to heal our environment. We don't have time to wait. And as Gopal mentioned, right, that there's a need for regeneration, for that the planet also needs time to heal herself too. And not just for ourselves, but every living being, right? Because we're also interconnected and our health is so codependent on all these other systems that we willingly choose to deny, right? Or look the other way. And I think it's one of those things why faith and spirituality or yeah, exactly. Even non-faith as well, too, that there are ways to connect back to the earth and to heal the earth. And there are solutions that they offer that we may not be able to explain with our current science, but that's not a reason to deny it anymore, especially since so many of our problems are a result of our own doing, like Lena had mentioned, right? Whether that's from greed or lack of compassion for others. And so, again, as a scientist, I'm all about the science, but I think what is so exciting about bringing faith and spirituality into the conversation is that there is so much science from them as well. And if we are just humble enough and smart enough to open our eyes to be like, hey, there is something there. So I'm oncology, right? That's my focus. So many of our chemotherapies are based on chemicals found in plants. And then we use science to either adapt them, right, for mass production for people who needed it, or use the intelligence that some of these plants have, right, to be able to create these drugs. So to say that somehow our science, right, is unlinked from the environment, or that ours is smarter, when we have relied so much on it. And to me, right, cancer is such a huge problem. And if we're relying on the earth for it, why would we not rely on it for anything else, right? And there's so much throughout our human history that we haven't understand, we chalked up to magic. And then science has explained it to us that, hey, this is actually a natural phenomenon that makes sense. And so, and I think that, again, to be humble, to recognize the severity of the situation, that so many of these frontline actors, these indigenous communities, have that nature-based, earth-based science that is just waiting for us to tap into. And if it wasn't for greed, if it wasn't for power, if it wasn't for whatever, we would have this problem solved. And Lena's mentioned all these solutions already, right, that are based on a science or an intelligence that comes from these faith traditions, that comes from indigenous traditions. And again, as a scientist, when there's evidence base, you use evidence base. And if you don't do it, you shouldn't be practicing, right? And so there's the reality of the situation. And I cannot stress enough that faith and science do not have to be at a disconnect. They are inextricably linked if we just open our eyes and be humble about it. So back over to you, Andrew.
Yes. The word interconnectedness has been used, I think, almost by all of us in one context. And I think that's that disconnect, the belief that we are above, beyond, other than the earth, and refusing to see that connection and almost insisting, and then driving everything we need from it. And it's a chaos. It really is an illusion that needs to be broken through. And I love that how you're talking about ways of knowing. And I think that's one thing that really needs to be broken. We've been doing this the same way for so long that we insist that's it's the only way that can and should be done, even when some of these systems are like 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. So this is a generation of knowledge that can and should be disrupted, and really, like you're saying, open up these eyes to seeing a fuller picture, to understanding that there's a spectrum of knowing, and that we do need to be, it's really an all hands on deck sort of moment of just saying, none of us are absolutely right. How do we reach into our own communities, these different traditions, these place-based solutions, to create what's best for people and the planet? And so, Chris, I want to step over to you now as we kind of think about, and to build off of Lena really speaking to food as a human right, food as part of that. And so just a bit on kind of why a rights-based approach, especially coming from a faith tradition, matters so much, and how does faith really amplify and support this movement?
Thanks for the conversation so far, and I hope I can contribute something in addition to the conversation that draws on what we've done over several months now. So I can provide my own perspective, but we've had, conversations with over 5 different webinars, 40 different people from faith perspectives. My faith perspective is evangelical Christian with the World Evangelical Alliance, and we're 600 million members in 129 countries, and so when we as a faith, and then representatives of faith that were in our webinars, some points were distilled in those conversations through careful listening, and so this is not a personal point I'm trying to make here. This is actually a point that comes from those conversations and from our tradition, and that is we can affirm this rights-based approach, and we can join with those that are not of faith to say, yes, we can have a universal food access derived from the 3 points that Lena described, but then there's faith-based foundations to those as well. One of those faith-based foundations is human dignity. From my Christian perspective, and I think it's shared by many other faiths, is that there is a dignity that comes from God. It's given to us as creatures, and we have to respect that. And life is dependent upon food, and to have human dignity, you have to have a food system that's commensurate with that human dignity. So, rights-based approach can come and we can share this universal food system access perspective. And it's not a personal opinion. That comes from a faith tradition. I want to make that very clear. So food is a human right. We can say yes. We can say equitable access to food. Yes. So you can have a right, and then you can have equitable access to food. Everybody should be able to have that. And then, what type of food is that? Well, it needs to be, in our conversations, listening to people. People were saying, there's also a right for food to be local. That is, I think what the conversation around that was, I think this also comes throughout traditions as well, my tradition, that we need to close the gap between our food systems and our lives and culture, like we've had in our traditions over millennia, that our faith and our food actually were very held close together. And what's happened in the food system, it's been broken apart, and so we've lost some really important aspects of the sacredness of food, the sacredness of others, the sacredness of of the creation and how it's being put together, how we to care for that. And all those pieces have kind of been broken apart. And now I think the system that we've got to work towards together, faith and non-faith, is to kind of transition to a new food system that brings it closer together. Involve the way we produce the food, the way we relate to it, and that food system then becomes healthier, physically, spiritually, socially, economically, and we move into something that's better. And this is what the moment is about right now. And this is why, what we've been doing in our, food coalition, by having these dialogues, is to getting this understanding out for us to talk about and say, how do we go to a new future? And that's the last thing I'll say. I think faith traditions help us move through transitions in a way that helps communities, helps individuals, helps societies transition. Faith has done that over and over and over and over and again. We have those resources in our faith traditions to move through the new things, and we need to pick those up again. So I'll leave it at that, because I want to hear, throw it to Paul and others and hear what they have to say about the conversation that we had over those last couple of weeks. So thanks. Hope that makes sense, and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I do think that as the world, COVID has absolutely flipped us on our heads. There's a scrambling, there's an uncertainty, there's an alienation, there's deeper fear. And I think this gets back to your point, Miriam, where there's like a mechanistic approach to, well, we just have to do this, and we produce this many more units, and we do this over here and do this over there, and we ship it this way, and boom, problem solved. But you don't get at that deep core of this like existential concern, of dread, of unknowing. And I don't think this is, calling people like, well, you need to convert and find a faith and go there. But I think there is a spiritual dimension to our being, to our understanding, that's rooted beyond the simple mechanism or the industrialization. And Chris, that's right. Back to these place-based approaches to the food that nourishes your body and your soul and helps remind you and connect you to your history, to the present, and to the moment of the future that can be. And right now we see the kind of that deterioration of that as our food systems become increasingly commodified, as the amount of food that we get to consume is lessened and lessened because of what's easy to produce and ship, to say very little of what, and this is something that was mentioned in an intervention yesterday, as the climate shifts, so too we don't really know how food is going to respond to that. So really holding on to crop diversity, to these local systems to see what works and what doesn't, so that we're not reliant on something that all of a sudden, if it doesn't do well in the heat, we're in a lot of trouble. And so I think that's part of the wisdom that we also need to bring into shape, is these place-based solutions aren't simply, they don't exist because it's this fanciful idea. It's because this is how it's always been. And this is really how we and the earth have come to be. And so I think, Paul, I want to ask you then, as you look at these large systems, as we look at how we've gotten here, colonization has of course come up, and decolonization, and kind of as we look at our food systems, how do we do that? And why is it so important to take this viewpoint and perspective? And before I leave it open to you, I also want to say, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Raise your hand. I can see it. We're going to have time at the end. We've been like speeding through this. We've been very efficient with our time. So please, if you have questions or have anything to say, I would love to hear about it. So Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. What a rich conversation it's been so far. And you've given me a difficult question. How do we decolonize our food systems, or how do we localize? I wish I had the answer to that. But as Chris was saying, in the dialogues that we convened over the last couple of months, looking at the different action tracks, we got some nuggets of truth and insights into wisdom and tradition, which were really shining brightly for all of us, I think. And I think it's coming back to this idea of relearning. In many cases, just a couple of generations ago, what our ancestors did, you know, understanding very traditional, simple ways of caring for the earth, for growing food, for caring for animals in ways that are harmonious, that are in balance and alignment to the rhythms and the kind of the energy of the earth. Because we see over time, as you said and others, that we see how food has uplifted people and the world, but also disrupted in many ways. And, you know, for example, just the livestock industry, the meat and dairy industry, to take one big example, you know, we see just how the overconsumption of animal products is so detrimental to health of the individual, but also detrimental to the health of the planet as well. And if we just go back 50, 60 years here in the West, you'll see that meat consumption was a fraction of what it is right now in the Western world. And we see, unfortunately, that across the world, as incomes increase, as the middle class increases, meat consumption increases as well. And so that's driving so much of the deforestation in the Amazon and in other parts of the world as well. So it's about, I really believe, and again, as Chris is saying, what came out of our dialogues is that it's not about individuals' ideas. These ideas are as old as the sun. You know, these are the ideas that our ancestors lived and walked with for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's what they passed down from generation to generation. And so it's about relearning those things. It's about, as you said, decolonizing our food systems, understanding how food has been so disruptive to our world and to our culture in so many ways, and trying to, just as in the environmental movement, there's this idea of rewilding the natural world. We need to, in a similar way, find a way, I don't know what the term would be, but to reinvigorate our food systems with this indigenous, natural, local understanding of what grows there. I always find, personal anecdote, I always find it difficult to eat citrus fruits in the middle of winter, because it's just not natural for the body. You know, if I'm in a cold climate, I need to eat food and fruits that are growing in that cold climate. You know, I can't eat a mango while I'm suffering in the middle of winter in New York City. It just feels alien for the body, because the body needs food which is being grown locally in that environment to nourish me at that time. And so these very simple understandings that have been in our traditions, faith traditions, wisdom traditions, indigenous traditions for hundreds of years, we need to excavate them, we need to learn them, and we need to apply them to the modern context of our global food systems. I really think that was one of the key things that came out of the dialogues we held earlier this year.
Thanks, Gopal. Appreciate that. And Denisa put into the chat, decolonizing is when the wild heals. And I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's this sense of decolonizing the food system themselves, but I think there's also this decolonization of our minds. And again, these memes and these tropes that just drive us down a road that we're not 100% sure why we're there. And now we're looking backwards and just like, oh my gosh, we really need to think differently. And so I do want to kind of ask you this, Lena, as we kind of transition it, as we look at, because there's a sense of praxis and theory. And I think really driving the sense of decolonization, of localization. And also there's another question here about right to food work in the FAO. If you want to tackle that one, I think you're much more qualified than I am there. But kind of as we look at both the role of local communities, also looking at these larger systems, working with industry, working with business, you know, where do you see these real touch points that are important, not only for the Food System Summit, but as we look beyond? Because we know the Food System Summit is a moment in time. It'll be a summit, and then the work is still done. And so how do you see this kind of systems change happening, where we can really start plugging in and helping these seeds to grow?
Wow, that's a big question, but I really love this conversation. I mean, where do you see this grow? What I want to link it to is what I've heard now in the conversation, and one of the words that I heard is the interconnectedness. And that's exactly what is happening now, also bringing it back to the Food System Summit, is to have a systems approach to things, to not just look like in a patient, just look at one issue, but look at the patient holistically. And that's also what we need to do with this issue as well. I mean, it's a technocratic way of approaching this interconnectedness, for me, is now what is really gaining prominence, is the One Health approach. It's promoted by the G20, the most powerful economies in the world, also because of COVID, where we've seen that people's health, animal health, and planetary health are connected. So this concept of interconnectedness is being taken forward by this One Health approach, and WHO is also very much engaged in this. We've recently now set up in the division of healthier populations a specific unit on One Health, which is really an important sign from our senior management. And we're going to work across the 3 levels on this One Health concept and provide advice and develop a One Health framework, and working with FAO on this. So that's a way of taking this forward in a kind of technocratic way, the One Health approach. But at the same time, I think this interconnectedness is also at a human level, that as humans, we need to be connecting with each other. And I think that's somehow missing. We're all, even now, in our little Zoom area, and we don't understand each other anymore, and we are just and we need to build that back. And again, this is where faith-based organizations can help. And I heard Mariam more than once mention the word humble. I mean, we can connect if we stay humble, and I think that's being lost. We think we're at the center of everything. We're just part of it. And we rely on each other, and we rely on the earth. And all these concepts need to be brought into all the technocratic approaches, which I see is missing, and we need to bring it back. And that's also why I was interested to talk with you and to get this interconnectedness back between the animals, between the ecosystems, but also between ourselves. And I think that's what we exactly are doing now, creating that connection again, which we need. Over.
Thanks, Lena. I was writing. Great, really great. I can't wait to rewatch this so I can actually get your quote right, because I think we're in the middle of everything, but it's great. I see there's a question in the chat. How do we include elements of faith in transforming food systems while respecting different faiths and beliefs? I think this is a really valuable question. And I think it really calls into question, there's such distinct relationships of food within all these different faiths. And I think as we look at the transformation that we need, and this is something I was talking with my boss, Corinne, about earlier, of just kind of this neocolonialism can't just be this overlay of, well, this is how it is, and this is how all these different cultures and traditions need to transform. I think, and we've said it here, this particularity and this sensitivity to traditions of how they respect food and how meat or other animal proteins play into them. But it reminds me of something that in our second dialogue, Olav, I can't remember Olav's last name right now. I hope he's not watching and that he forgives me, but he's great. But more or less his point was, and Gopal, you said this too, is we need to get away from the insane relationship that we have with meat. It's not that meat in itself is problematic. What's problematic is our dietary approach to meat and this overconsumption. And it's ludicrous to say to a population that's reliant upon meat, whether that's the Gwich'in in Alaska, to be like, well, you can't do caribou anymore. I'm so sorry. Here's some plant-based. It doesn't work. And I think that's why this nuance, this complexity, this full approach to these problems is so necessary. And so I think that's for me where it really comes into play, and why context, why particularity, and why localization matters so much. These people have been living this way for a very long time. They're doing great until a candy bar showed up and they were told, like, well, this is even better. And now they have diabetes. It's just troublesome. And so for me, it's really getting back to the sense of sanity, moving away from what makes the most money and towards what makes the most sense for the people, the planet, the ecosystem, the animals that are reliant on where we are. We've got 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in here and say some final words. Otherwise, I'm sure I can fill 4 minutes. But anyone want to raise a hand, and any final thoughts? Yeah, Lena.
Yeah, I think it's a good question again, like how to have all the faiths together. And again, this humbleness comes in, and not like, oh, my faith is better than the other. I mean, the food connects all of them. It's the connector. It's the connector between people, and we have to use it to become this strong voice in realizing this food system transformation, respecting human rights, making sure that leaving no one behind. And coming back to the question on what FAO's work, I just want to flag again, I don't know if you can see it now, that there's the sustainable healthy diets guiding principles that were published 2 years ago. And it shows for having healthy and sustainable diets, what are the principles with relation to health, with relation to environmental impact, but also socio-cultural aspects. So we are really working on it, that it has to be built on and respect local culture, culinary practices, knowledge and consumption patterns, and values on the way food is sourced, produced, and consumed. I mean, this is a WHO, FAO publication that has this as a principle, a guiding principle for sustainable and healthy diets. So we need to build on this guiding principles and take this forward. I just wanted to flag this over.
Thanks so much, Lena. To you, Miriam, in like a minute, maybe 30 seconds.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just real quick, I was going to say the Q&A about how do you incorporate the different faiths or elements while respecting. I think our coalition has been a perfect example of that. Thank God for that, right? Just like all our different faiths coming together, showing this collective wisdom, right? That's come from God, that's whatever tradition you come from. And so in the last little nugget, I just like to say, I just thought of this now, is that there's a big quote in Islam that says, to God do we belong, and to him do we return. And if you think of God as all encompassing and as the earth, right, as a manifestation of a gift for that, we can't deny our relationship to the earth, and that we have to one day go back to her. So thanks for letting me say that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Chris, Wanda, yeah.
No, I just want to make sure that you saw Tim's question in the things, because he wants to know what the next step for the coalition at the Food System Summit. So, there's a softball to you, Andrew. Just hit it right out of the park now.
Sure. Well, before I do that, Denisa, thank you again. I copy and pasted this. This is an incredible quote, but I want to read it out loud. Our stewardship of collective continuance of applying ancestral wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge is critical to healthy future generations. 100%. And I think this, again, humility of understanding. And I think there's this quote that just keeps on coming up for me. And it's the Audre Lorde quote about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I think we're at a moment where we're seeing the inefficiency, the insufficiency of predominant wisdom and knowledge as we approach these food systems. And we need to take a step back, and we need to look at whether it's indigenous wisdom, faith and wisdom traditions, people who just aren't bought into industrial commodified food systems going to them saying, hey, this agroecology thing really seems to work. Let's apply. And I think this is, and Lena, you were saying it before we entered into this conversation. This is it. We need to get this right. There isn't, and I think this radical truth telling, the honesty about where we are in this moment, about what is possible. And I think that's something I was reading, like, what happens if the next 50 years are the best years that we've ever seen? We're so caught on this worst case, falling to the abyss, it's all going to go apart. But the opportunity to be better, to do better, to reevaluate, reconstruct is right there. And I think that is also something that that I rely on spiritual and faith traditions for, is that ability to think of a way out of no way. And so for us to wrap this up, because now we're a minute over, I'm sorry about that. People have to go to bed or wake up, I'm not sure where you are right now. But this coalition, as Chris said, was always geared towards seeing what there could be, of bringing together a diversity of thinkers, of faith traditions, of expertises, to throw it all into a pot and say what works and what doesn't, and how do we get there. Out of that, we'll be developing an interfaith statement that we'll be releasing at the sidelines of the summit. We're also working on a report. And I think going forward, for me at least, this has been an amazing excuse to organize 40 incredible organizations to pick their minds and figure out, how do we do this together? And so we'll be developing a coalition that moves forward to try to put into action, into education, into advocacy, and hopefully into system development, these ideas, and really help push the narratives that are coming out of this to really live up and live out what we know can happen. And so I'm so grateful to this group of people, to you, Lena, for joining us, to Gopal, Chris, and Miriam, for being a part of making this work successful up until this point. And really thank you to everyone who joined in. I'm so excited to keep the conversation going, really looking forward to what comes next. Thanks for all the great questions. I'm going to wrap up because, we're over time and there's things to do. So thank you to everybody. Really looking forward to the next time, and really appreciate you being here with us today. So with that.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.